It was a war fought in the shadows, far from the grand naval battles that would define the Pacific theater. Here, victory wasn't measured in the thunder of 16-inch guns, but in the frantic clatter of a wrench on a rusted bolt. It was a conflict where the greatest enemy wasn't an imperial fleet, but the very ground beneath your feet. A primordial mud that could swallow a truck whole, a jungle that rotted steel, and a supply line stretched so thin it was more of a prayer than a fact. On the night of March 17, 1943, at a remote Allied outpost called Tufi, the war for America's vaunted PT boats wasn't against the Japanese, it was against itself. As PT-67 and PT-119 refueled at a makeshift jetty, a stray spark met a slick of gasoline on the water. The result was instantaneous. A sheet of flame erupted between the two boats, climbing their wooden hulls like a predator. There was no time to cast off lines, no time to fight the blaze. Men who had prepared to face enemy destroyers could only leap for their lives into the dark, fuel-slicked water. Ammunition cooked off in staccato bursts, a chaotic parody of combat. Gasoline tanks exploded, sending fireballs into the humid New Guinea night. The two boats, the pride of the Mosquito Fleet, sank at the dock. The fire, not content with its naval victory, leaped to the jetty, then to a nearby Australian cargo ship, and finally to a gasoline dump ashore. 6 depth charges, stacked and waiting for a Japanese submarine that would never come, detonated in a single earth-shattering blast. For 2 days, the fires burned. When the smoke cleared, the accounting was grim. 2 PT boats, a cargo ship, 4,000 barrels of precious gasoline, and the entire advanced base jetty gone. And the cause? Not a daring enemy raid, not a brilliant tactical maneuver. It was a single, carelessly tossed match. This incident, buried in the footnotes of the Pacific War, is more than just a tragic accident. It's a key. It's a window into a truth that history often overlooks. We remember the PT boat through the legend of John F. Kennedy's PT-109, a tale of heroic survival in the Solomons. We see it in propaganda films, a sleek, lightning-fast David slaying the Japanese Goliath. But that is the myth. This video will argue that in the forgotten war for New Guinea, the PT boat's real story was not one of glorious combat against warships. Its true, unglamorous victory was achieved in a brutal, grinding war against a different set of enemies, a broken supply chain, an impossible environment, and an enemy that refused to fight the war America had planned for. This is the story of how the Mosquito Fleet's greatest battle was not for control of the sea, but for its own survival, and how, through sheer, bloody-minded ingenuity, they helped starve an empire, one rickety barge at a time. To understand the brutal reality of New Guinea, we must first appreciate the myth the PT boat was built upon. In the early days of World War II, America was captivated by the idea of the Mosquito Fleet. These weren't lumbering battleships or majestic carriers. They were the naval equivalent of fighter planes. Built of plywood and powered by 3 gargantuan Packard V-12 engines, they were designed for one thing: speed. The Elco 80-foot patrol torpedo boat could slice through the waves at over 40 knots, a blur of mahogany and spray. Their mission profile was as audacious as their design. Dash in under the cover of darkness, unleash a salvo of 4 Mark 8 torpedoes at an enemy warship, and then use their blistering speed to escape before the giant they had just angered could find them in its sights. It was a romantic, almost cinematic vision of naval warfare. The press loved it. Propaganda posters depicted PT boats charging through rooster tails of foam, torpedoes leaping from their tubes towards silhouetted Japanese cruisers. They were the underdog weapon for an underdog nation, a symbol of American ingenuity and daring. And this myth wasn't entirely without substance. In the Solomon Islands, PT boats engaged in desperate, chaotic night battles against the Tokyo Express, the relentless convoys of Japanese destroyers supplying Guadalcanal. It was here that a young lieutenant junior grade named John F. Kennedy would cement the PT boat's legend in the American consciousness. His story, and others like it, created the archetype. The dashing young skipper, his loyal crew, and their fragile wooden boat facing down the steel behemoths of the Imperial Japanese Navy. This was the accepted wisdom. This was the war the crews trained for, the one they expected to fight. But in early 1943, as the 7th Fleet under Rear Admiral Arthur S. Carpenter took command in the Southwest Pacific, a different kind of war was brewing. The theater was New Guinea, a massive, primordial island that General MacArthur saw as a critical stepping stone on his long road back to the Philippines. For the Japanese, it was a fortress, a bastion to protect their southern flank, and a dagger aimed at the heart of Australia. Unlike the compact island chains of the Solomons, New Guinea was a continent in miniature. Its interior was a fortress of saw-toothed mountains, impenetrable jungles, and disease-ridden swamps. The war here would be fought along the coast, a grueling, inch-by-inch slog from one malaria-infested beachhead to the next. And for the PT boats assigned to Task Group 70.1, this new battlefield would systematically dismantle every romantic notion they had about their mission. Their primary antagonist wouldn't be a Japanese admiral. It would be the very island itself. Their main base of operations, Base 6, was established at Kanakopa, in a small harbor at the southeastern tip of New Guinea. By local standards, it was a good site. By any other standard, it was a quagmire. For months, the base was a sea of mud so deep and viscous that it famously swallowed an entire truck, leaving only a faint outline to mark its grave. This wasn't the clean, efficient naval base of the newsreels. This was a frontier outpost carved from chaos. The logistical chain, the lifeblood of any military operation, was stretched to the breaking point. Commander Morton C. Mama Jr., the man in charge, found himself fighting a constant, losing battle not against the enemy, but against paperwork and distance. His letters to the 7th Fleet staff in Brisbane read like a litany of despair. On March 5th, he noted that 320 drums of gasoline, enough for dozens of patrols, had simply vanished en route. By April, he had no replacement propeller shafts left for his 80-foot boats and was desperately trying to cannibalize and refit damaged shafts from smaller 77-footers. Construction of the base was perpetually delayed because there were no ships to carry the materials. Everything was a struggle. When an engine needed to be replaced, a common occurrence for the temperamental Packards, the process was a masterpiece of improvisation. A boat would motor across the bay to where new engines were stored in crates, simply left under a tree. A small army crane would hoist the 12,500-pound engine onto the boat's deck. Back at the dock, the crew would wrestle the old engine out and the new one in, before returning the broken one to its crate under the same tree. There was no dry dock. For hull repairs, boats had to be hauled out on an old maritime railway on a nearby island. This railway was powered by a manual winch, operated by local Papuan villagers. Two men would turn crank handles on each end of a drum, their pace dictated by another man blowing on a conch shell. With each blast, they would crank faster until exhaustion forced them to stop. It took 2 agonizing hours to haul a single boat out of the water, and the railway was so short that mechanics often had to work on the stern while standing waist-deep in the tepid, murky water. This wasn't a temporary inconvenience. It was the daily reality. The shortage of everything was so acute that it forced the squadrons into a state of communal cannibalism. Auxiliary generators were a precious commodity. A single generator would be shared between several boats, moved from one to the next each day just to keep the patrol schedule going. The same went for radios, radar sets, and even machine guns. If a boat was laid up for hull repairs, it was immediately stripped of any functioning parts to keep its sisters running. When its repairs were complete, it would in turn receive parts from the next boat to be damaged. It was a desperate Sisyphean struggle to maintain a functional fighting force in a place that seemed determined to rust, rot, and swallow every piece of equipment sent to it. This was the world before the first shot was even fired in anger. The stage was set, not for a glorious naval campaign, but for a war of attrition where the most valuable weapon was a sailor's ingenuity. For the crews living this logistical nightmare, the myth of the destroyer killer must have felt like a distant dream. Yet, the hope remained. They were still training for that decisive moment, that high-speed torpedo run against a Japanese warship. In early March 1943, it seemed that moment had finally arrived. Allied reconnaissance aircraft spotted a massive enemy convoy steaming south from the Japanese stronghold of Rabaul. 8 destroyers escorting 8 large merchant ships, packed with nearly 7,000 troops and supplies, were heading for the garrisons at Lae and Salamaua on New Guinea's northern coast. This was it. This was the Tokyo Express of New Guinea. The resulting engagement, fought from March 2nd to March 4th, would become known as the Battle of the Bismarck Sea. But it would not be a naval battle. The PT boats, readied for action at their advanced base in Tufi, would not be the stars of this show. General George Kenney's 5th Air Force would claim that honor. In a stunning and brutal demonstration of air power, American and Australian bombers, B-17s, B-25s, and Beaufighters, launched relentless waves of attacks. They pioneered a devastating new tactic called skip bombing, releasing bombs at treetop level that would skip across the water like stones and slam into the sides of the ships at the waterline. The result was annihilation. For 2 days, the skies over the Bismarck Sea were filled with the drone of engines and the crump of explosions. Japanese Zero fighters, scrambled to protect the convoy, were swatted from the sky. One by one, the Japanese ships were torn apart. By the night of March 3rd, the convoy had ceased to exist. What was once a proud flotilla was now a scattering of burning wrecks and oil slicks. This was the turning point. But it wasn't the one the PT boat crews had been waiting for. For them, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea wasn't an opportunity. It was a fundamental redefinition of their war. The overwhelming victory of Allied air power sent a shockwave through the Japanese high command. The message was brutally, unequivocally clear. They could no longer risk sending surface ships from Rabaul to resupply their forces in New Guinea. It was suicide. They would never try again. And just like that, the PT boat's primary, myth-defining mission, sinking destroyers and transport ships, vanished from the battlefield. The Goliaths had been slain, but by someone else. The Davids of the sea, with their 4 torpedoes and their dreams of glory, had been relegated to the role of janitors. Their new war began on the night of March 3rd. As 10 PT boats fanned out into the Huon Gulf, they weren't hunting for a fleet. They were looking for survivors and stragglers. They found a single abandoned cargo ship, burning brightly in the distance. After confirming it was deserted, PT-143 and PT-150 put torpedoes into its hull, sending the smoldering vessel to the bottom. It was their first kill in the campaign, but it was an execution, not a battle. In the days that followed, their true mission became grimly apparent. The warm waters of the Gulf were filled with the debris of the convoy, and with thousands of Japanese soldiers clinging to life rafts, wreckage, and makeshift boats. For the PT boat crews, the task was horrific, but strategically vital. These weren't helpless shipwreck survivors. They were thousands of armed, disciplined Imperial soldiers. If they managed to reach the lightly defended Allied coastline, they could form a formidable fighting force. So, the PT boats began the grim work of barge busting. They crisscrossed the debris field, their 50 caliber machine guns chattering, sinking the rafts and barges one by one. This wasn't the clean, almost abstract warfare of a torpedo striking a ship from a mile away. This was intimate and brutal. It was a task that would define their war in New Guinea. A relentless campaign of interdiction aimed not at winning a battle, but at slowly and methodically starving the enemy. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea had shattered the myth. The torpedo, their weapon of destiny, was now almost irrelevant. Their new primary weapon was the machine gun. Their new primary target wasn't a cruiser, but a crowded, desperate barge. The war of glory was over. The war of attrition had just begun. The aftermath of the Bismarck Sea created a new reality. The Japanese war machine in New Guinea, denied its maritime lifeline, was forced to adapt. Its lifeblood now trickled down the coast, not in large transports, but in a nocturnal parade of small, armored barges. These vessels, shielded by the jungle-lined coast during the day, would scurry from cove to cove under the cover of darkness, carrying troops, ammunition, and meager rations. The grand strategy of naval warfare was replaced by 1,000 tiny, desperate skirmishes in the dark. This was the autopsy of a failed strategy, and the PT boats were the surgeons. Their role was now that of a nocturnal predator, a coastal guerrilla force. The tactics they developed were born of necessity and had no place in any pre-war naval doctrine. On the night of March 15th, two boats, PT-129 and PT-114, decided to ambush the barges at their destination. They slipped into Mambara Bay, a known unloading point, and waited. PT-114 dropped anchor, its engines silent, while PT-129 patrolled the entrance. In the rain and poor visibility, chaos ensued. Two Japanese barges, completely unaware of the American presence, drifted right into the anchored PT-114. They were so close that the PT boat's forward guns couldn't depress low enough to fire. The American crew, recovering from their shock, grabbed Thompson's submachine guns and raked the barges at point-blank range. As PT-114's powerful engines roared to life, one barge was shredded by the rear turrets, while the other was simply crushed under the boat's bow as it surged forward. It was a messy, frantic brawl, a world away from the calculated geometry of a torpedo attack. This was the new face of combat. This shift in mission created a cascade of new problems, a ripple effect that exposed every weakness in the PT boat's strained logistical tether. The first and most critical problem was distance. The barges hugged the coastline, forcing the PT boats to operate in a hazardous environment of hidden reefs, sandbars, and floating debris. Their advanced base at Tufi was a grueling 180 miles from their primary patrol areas in the Huon Gulf. A single nightly patrol meant spending the majority of their time, and more importantly, their precious high-octane gasoline, simply commuting to the fight. They would arrive on station with only a few hours to hunt before having to turn back. The entire war became a brutal calculus of fuel consumption versus time on target. This logistical strain led directly to the first domino falling, the establishment of even more remote, even more precarious advanced bases. The hunt began for a suitable harbor closer to the action. Commander Mama himself took PT-142 to scout Douglas Harbor, and later Lieutenant Commander Atkins identified Morobe Harbor as an even better location, saving over 200 miles of travel per patrol. Morobe was perfect, with a deep river flanked by tall trees providing excellent natural cover. But establishing a base is more than just finding a spot on a map. It requires men, tools, fuel, and equipment, all of which were in critically short supply. This desperation set the stage for the second domino to fall. On March 28th, the effort to establish the new base at Douglas Harbor began. A small, strange vessel, the HMS Mosquito, was tasked with carrying the essential supplies. The Mosquito was a former World War I destroyer, converted to diesel power and having spent the interwar years hauling bananas. As this unlikely warship steamed towards the coast, it was spotted by Japanese dive bombers. The pilots, their nerves undoubtedly frayed by the recent decimation at the Bismarck Sea, mistook the old banana boat for a modern warship. They attacked with ferocious enthusiasm. The Mosquito was hit multiple times and sank, taking with it the entire kit for the new base: tools, spare parts, fuel pumps, 400 barrels of gasoline, and all radio equipment. A case of mistaken identity by an enemy now terrified of surface ships had achieved what a destroyer couldn't. It had crippled PT boat operations in the area for nearly a month. It was a bitter, tragic irony. The fear of air power that had redefined the PT boat's mission was now actively sabotaging their ability to carry it out. The third domino fell not from enemy action, but from the fog of war itself. As Allied forces pushed west, a new fear emerged: a potential Japanese thrust through the Torres Strait to threaten Darwin and the northern coast of Australia. Intelligence was murky, but the threat was considered real enough to divert precious resources. A significant detachment of PT boats from Squadron 7 was sent to Thursday Island, a remote speck of land in the strait, to act as a defensive screen. They established PT Base 10 in Darwin to support this potential new front. For months, these boats and men stood guard against a ghost fleet. The Japanese never came. They were too bogged down, too starved and battered elsewhere to even contemplate such an attack. The shallow waters of the coast would have been a nightmare for torpedoes anyway, which would have likely buried themselves in the mud on their first dive. This phantom fleet tied up a sizable portion of the available PT boat force, chasing shadows while their sister boats to the north were desperately short of hulls, parts, and men. The cumulative effect of these events, the shift to barge hunting, the devastating fire at Tufi, the sinking of the Mosquito, and the wild goose chase to Thursday Island, paints a stark picture. This wasn't a campaign of bold naval strategy. It was a chaotic, hand-to-mouth existence defined by constant setbacks, improvisation, and non-combat losses. The twist, the great secret of the New Guinea campaign, is that the PT boats were fighting a multi-front war. They were fighting the Japanese at night, but they were fighting their own supply lines, the unforgiving environment, and the sheer friction of war 24 hours a day. And it was this second, unglamorous war that truly defined their struggle and ultimately their victory. When we zoom out and look at the legacy of the PT boats in the New Guinea campaign, a startling statistic comes into focus. By the conventional metrics of naval warfare, the metrics of the myth, they were an abject failure. In the entirety of their operations along the New Guinea coast, a theater of war spanning hundreds of miles and lasting for years, they did not sink a single major Japanese warship. Not one destroyer, not one cruiser. Their torpedoes, the weapons that defined their very existence, were almost entirely a non-factor. But to judge them by this standard is to fundamentally misunderstand the war they were actually fighting. Their victory was not written in the dramatic explosions of torpedo hits on steel hulls. It was written in the quiet, creeping starvation of the Japanese garrisons at Lai and Salamaua. It was measured in the increasing desperation of an enemy cut off from reinforcement and resupply. The PT boats, in concert with the 5th Air Force, didn't defeat the Japanese army in a decisive battle. They created a hermetic seal around the coast. The Air Force owned the day, and the Mosquito Fleet owned the night. Their real victory was a masterpiece of attrition. Every barge sunk was a squad of soldiers that would never be reinforced, a case of ammunition that would never be fired, a bag of rice that would never be eaten. The constant, terrifying threat of a PT boat lurking in every dark cove forced the Japanese into an impossible position. Their coastal supply route, their last resort after the Bismarck Sea disaster, became a gauntlet of death. The slow, methodical strangulation of these garrisons was a critical, if unsung, factor in the success of MacArthur's entire island-hopping campaign. They didn't win the war, but they created the conditions that made winning possible. The timeless, universal lesson from the mud-caked, grease-stained story of the New Guinea PT boats is one that echoes through the history of conflict. It's a lesson about the true nature of war. War is not always the glorious charge or the brilliant maneuver seen on a map in headquarters. More often, it is the tired mechanic figuring out how to fashion a new gasket from a piece of scrap rubber. It is the skipper carefully weighing the cost and fuel of investigating a suspicious shadow. It is the crew sharing a single generator between 3 boats just to make the next patrol. War is logistics. War is maintenance. War is a battle against chaos itself. The story of the PT boat is so much larger and more complex than the single heroic tale of PT-109. That story is true and important, but it is not the only story. The experience of the men in New Guinea, fighting a war of scraps and ingenuity, is just as vital. Their legacy is a powerful reminder that victory is often achieved not by the side with the most advanced weapons, but by the side that can simply keep its machines running one day longer than the enemy. It's a testament to the unglamorous, indispensable grit that lies at the heart of any military success. It proves that sometimes the most important battles are the ones fought far from the front lines, with a wrench in one hand and a prayer in the other. This hidden history challenges us to look beyond the popular myths and appreciate the complex, often messy reality of the past. What other forgotten fronts or unglamorous victories do you think deserve more attention? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this deep dive into the real war of the Mosquito Fleet compelling, please hit the like button, subscribe for more historical investigations, and share this video with anyone who believes history is found in the details. Thank you for watching.